Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ancient Assyrian Props and Costumes. I'm Donald Barkho, and today we'll be talking about Ancient Assyrian Scale Armour. This is part 4 of my series, and here I'd like to take some time to discuss some of my suggestions and conclusions regarding Ancient Assyrian armor. So in the previous video of part 3, we were talking about lacing these scales, which are now in the British Museum. These are ancient Assyrian scales, which were supposedly found in Ardabil in Iran, and they have been identified as Neo-Assyrian armor scales. Now, in that video I go into the lacing method and some of the research behind why that lacing method was not totally to my satisfaction, and that is due to the sources, especially in John Curtis's thesis, which was published in 2013, but was written in 1979, called An Examination of Late Assyrian Metalwork, starting from page 46, W bracket armor scales. He goes into discuss ancient Assyrian armor scales that have been found. So we're not going to rehash everything there. If you'd like to see that video, go ahead and skip to part 3 of Ancient Assyrian Scale Armour. So this is a lacing method that I'm suggesting in regards to these scales, and there is method to this madness. And the way I came up with this method is actually tied into what I discovered regarding some other ancient Assyrian scales, such as these ones, for which there is not only archaeological evidence, but there is a photo which shows remnants of lacing in regards to these scales. This scale is number 309, type 12C, and these were found in the ancient city of Kalhu, an archaeological site by the name of Nimrud in Iraq today, which was the capital of the ancient Assyrian Empire during the early Neo-Assyrian period. And then there is these scales, which are based off an image in his thesis, made here to scale. This is also made to scale, and this also has archaeological evidence for it. These ones being in bronze, and these ones being in iron. Now, in last week's episode, we examined these Neo-Assyrian scales that are in the British Museum, and a possible suggestion given by the museum in regards to their lacing, which is different to what I have here. This is what I've been able to come up with, and you will see that it's still very flexible. Disregard the poor quality of the actual lacing material itself. I didn't realize how weak it was until I actually started using it to try lace up. I should have stuck with my cotton cord. However, I do think that it gives a very good contrast to the white, and here you can see the horizontal stitching that's behind this row, hidden here, and then the horizontal stitching up at the top to gather the rows, and then this row is stitched to this row in crisscross method, but it still retains, as you can see, it's actually tied to this bottom area and nests perfectly in this area where the next midrib for this one starts. So it covers the vulnerability of this particular thread, and it also gives a way to be able to minimize the slippage that happens across the midribs all in one go. So we get protection for that vulnerable stitching there, and we also still have maintained our concertina, whether it be that way and this way too. You still get a bit of play in it, quite a lot. Now, my suggestions in regards to this type of armor is that they're rather big scales, especially when you compare them to other types of ancient Assyrian armor scales here and here, just to get an idea of the differences in the size, and everything in regards to this armor is telling me that it's horse armor. Now, with this particular style of lacing system, you can imagine the body of a horse in a curved shape, and this armor going over the horse's body on each side, so that on this side it would be like this, and on that side it will be like that. And it takes the curve of the horse beautifully. The extra large size compared to these other scales, would dramatically increase the amount of surface area you're covering with each scale. Now, another reason why I'm suggesting that it's horse armor and not body armor is because when you curve the armor in this fashion, what happens is those scales will tend to open up. The bigger the scale is, the slighter the curve, the more the opening will be. It's due to the actual size of the scale. That's what's causing the opening to be larger than what it needs to be. For example, here is Ancient Assyrian armor. From these scales have been made in replica of the ones in the Metropolitan Museum. But you can see how beautifully not only does it take the curve, but it minimizes the amount of opening you get in between the scales when it does take a curve. It can take more of an acute curve, and not only that, but it feels almost like a fabric that's been constructed out of metal instead of something like these scales. That's why I'm suggesting this. Now, the lacing method that I used, the idea I picked up from having experienced what it took for me to figure out how these particular lacing systems worked, and we'll get into them shortly. But right now, I'll get into this particular example. So we know that these scales were from the Metropolitan Museum, discovered by Malawan in Nimrod, in ancient Kalhu in Iraq. And what we see here is ancient Assyrian scales with a stitching pattern that is reminiscent of ancient Assyrian reliefs, especially from the time period of Sennacherib. Now, in the last video, I showed you an example of how I had stitched the two layers together, and it was not giving me the concertina I needed. However, these ones give me all the concertina I need, and that is due to the idea that I picked up in the British lacing system of butting instead of overlapping the scales together. Now, before that time period, I was always curious at why this particular hole, it was larger than all the other holes. And it makes sense now after having attempted to use the same method of crisscrossing in and out in a diagonal pattern as I did to create the zigzag or the X pattern in these scales in the last video. Here, what's happening is you can see that in this particular case, that big hole would be right here. And it's a junction for 4 threads, whereas these ones up here don't need as many, especially if you disregard this stitching and you only have your crisscrosses. So if you had your crisscrosses, these top holes would only accommodate 2 threads, whereas this big hole here would be accommodating 4 threads, and hence the reason for the larger hole in these particular scales. Now, this has been achieved by crisscrossing, which gives you this on the back, you can see. And not only that, but these scales were found alongside with some other scales, these ones being a smaller version of these, but using a different amount of holes. So this one has a 6-hole system, whereas this one has a 7-hole system. You see here 2, 4, 6, and that's 7. Now we know that these two are for the horizontal lacings. Therefore, you have 1, 2, and 3 holes remaining to use in order to stitch this row to that row. And that was achieved by going in from behind, coming out, going into that large hole, and then out the back and into here, and then out the front into that large hole, and then out the back into here, and so forth until the entire crisscross pattern was achieved. So you can see using the method of lacing suggested, but going through a few more holes works perfectly, especially with the idea of butting the scales up in regards to these scales from the Metropolitan Museum. So here, I believe we have an accurate reconstruction of the lacing system for these particular scales. However, using that same method of zigzagging in and out could not be achieved in regards to these scales. In these scales, there is a picture given in his thesis, which blown up looks something very similar to this. And here you can get an idea of the scales. However, when you look closely at this image, you will notice that there you can get glimpses of some of the lacing or remnants of where the lacing was. You can see the zigzag patterns and the way they protrude from this hole to into that hole, into that hole, for example. Now, his arrangement that he gives for this particular number of 309, here is the 309 scales. This is a blown up picture of that. Here is the arrangement for the 309, and this is incorrect. How? Let me show you. So if I was to arrange them in the same order that I have here in this example, then one would not be able to stitch them either together, and what would happen is if I was to crisscross them in this fashion, I tried this out, the lacing, I would end up literally with a straight line between this one and that one here, which is incorrect. Here is an example. They were originally one on top of the other, straight in a pattern just like this. However, what's happened is, once the actual scales were buried and with pressure of time and thousands of years of debris on top of them, the scales have shifted and then given us what we now see here. So that shifting pattern is possible because in an example such as this one, what happens is every time you overlay your scale so that this one is directly above this one, there is always a small gap left which allows for that movement for concertina in the horizontal fashion. However, if I was to place that hard up against the inside edge of this scale, it will give me the offset that I need, but it won't give me the play that's needed for the horizontal concertina, because they would be locked into place. This is a very unusual scale in that when we analyze it, it's got these two holes for stitching your horizontal and these two holes stitching your horizontal, leaving only these two holes for lacing, which is unusual. Usually you see, for example, in this case, and in many other examples, they have a hole above the midrib and here and below the midrib as well, assuming that this is the bottom and this is the top. So in this case, you can see clearly that there is no hole here. That hole above the midrib is not there in the archaeological evidence on this particular scale. So what's happened is you have to come up with a lacing system that is identical to what we see here in the archaeological evidence. And another thing that's unusual about these scales is, in this case and in many other cases such as here, what we see is all the lacing is done in between this rib and this rib. So you've got this midrib and this midrib. The lacing is done in that section of the flat. Here too, the lacing is done in that section of the flat. In that example here too, the lacing is done in the flat area above the midrib and below the midrib of the second one. So in this case, what we see is the actual stitching going over the midrib, which is unlike anything else I've ever seen or any other suggestion of stitching. So what's going on? In order for me to be able to stitch them, I quickly realized that after having done my horizontal rows, it was impossible for me then to lace this in a crisscross fashion as suggested in this example here and suggested by the British Museum, because there is no hole pierced in this one for me to be able to go up into the next one. It literally is impossible to do that. Now, another thing is, if I was to offset the scale and supposedly line this hole up with this hole here in the corner, which will give me the perfect placement if I was to offset them, what happens is the next scale, which is meant to sit like this, clearly blocks the hole for me to be able to go into that particular hole. So that offset method is incorrect, and the lacing method suggested here is incorrect, and also the one in the British Museum in regards to these scales, the 309 scales, because of the placement of the holes. So here you can clearly see me in my very early attempts after I had printed out images and then tried to have a go at lacing them. My natural instincts were to put the lacing in between the midribs. But when you analyze the archaeological evidence, you can clearly see the remnants of lacing that if no longer there, you can still see the traces of the lacing in the image of them going from this hole into this hole and so forth, from this hole into that hole. Now, not only that, but you can also notice that there is 2 stitches coming out at least of each hole. So here, just like this example, there's 2 stitches coming from that hole there. So now I can't go from this hole into this hole and then come out the back and continue my stitching, so forth and so forth. And if I stitch it up in this method where I go zigzagging across, what we clearly see here is that the lacing is coming up into the top hole. So I can't lace it in a zigzag fashion from the front either. So what the only way to do it was, here is my example of the scales actually made to scale. That's these ones here, using exactly the same hole system. And you can clearly see the stitching goes over the midrib, just like this one, and it goes over into that hole, over into that hole. This lacing here could be questionable, the extra horizontal ones here that I've put, but at the very least, you would get, this is a blown up version of the same scale, you would get this happening. That crisscross, at the very least, is what's being shown on the archaeological evidence of these ancient Assyrian scales found in the ancient city of Kalhu, Assyria. So what happens? How does it work? So the way that I stitched it was in this fashion. So I went from this hole into that one, came out the back, and then crisscrossed it over that one, went here, then continued my crisscross here under behind this one, and then into there. That was the only way I was able to get what I'm getting here, and using the holes that have been provided. Surprising to me, what I found was that this is pure lamellar. This is what you get. You get total concertina. Total concertina. And mind you, these scales were not individually cut out like some of these ones were, but this was a very surprising to me to see that not only do we have concertina, we actually have lamellar scales. So that's proof from the archaeological data with this reconstructed lacing system that this particular example of ancient Assyrian armor scales is lamellar. You can see the way it moves. This is pure lamellar. You get full concertina in this particular example. And there are other examples of Assyrian lamellar, but we'll go into that another time, just in a moment. Now what's happening is, here is the example made from the actual scales themselves, and you can see how much they concertina. They overlap completely. Beautiful, beautiful method of construction from the ancient Assyrians. So this goes to show that these particular scales, the 309s, laced in this way, give you complete concertina in this way, and they even have concertina in this way too. They can flex, and that's why I'm saying that what's happened is, so if I was to line these up like this, there is a gap that's created, but what's happened is when they were thrown on the floor or excavated, they were excavated having been fused together in this fashion. So that will give you what's going on in these rows. Now in these examples, you can see not all the rows are perfectly aligned. So this example is able to produce all and any of the angles seen within the archaeological data that we see here, thus confirming this method of lacing, which is totally different to this actual arrangement of armor scales from Nimrud that has been used as an example for these particular scales, which are totally different as well to those. when we look closer at this particular image zoomed in, you definitely need the PDF file to have a look at it. What you will notice is that those scales are these ones here. And you either get, if you're going to take for granted what this is saying, you're either going to get this type of stitching, see how it is from the back. You get that crisscross fashion that's on the front, and then you get the crisscross fashion on the back, because you're lacing it out in a diagonal fashion, back to front, and then front to back again. However, in this particular case, which is my suggestion, you get the lamellar example, and in the archaeological data, some of the scales have been turned upside down in this fashion. You can also obtain them in this method, but you can see if this was the case, then these stitches that are on the back would be clearly visible. However, on the image, when you blow it up, you don't really see those extra stitches on the back of the scales. And here is another example of what it would look like in this case, of the scales when they had been flipped. So you can see that the stitching comes out from the midsection of the scale, and then inserts into there and crisscrosses again, just like you're doing a figure eight. But you do your figure eight, and then you skip to the next one, do your figure eight, and then you'll do another row of figure eights, which will complete the row of zigzags. And what that does is that gives you lamellar again. And what I have noticed is that these crisscrosses, the particular place where it crisscrosses, they all catch and fall in between the curved heads of the scales themselves. So here would be a better case to show. So what happens is, see how when gathered, those X's, they catch the scales and stop them from going any further. But you can see on these 336, which is the same example here used, the midrib is low in the bottom half of the scale. This midrib is, you would think center, but center of the scale would be roughly about here. So it's a little bit lower than center. But these ones definitely, if this is the center of the scale, you can see this midrib is totally above. Now, what would be the advantage of such a system? Well, obviously, you've got flexibility on a totally different level, even though you have total flexibility here too with this method. But you have much more flexibility than these ones. Even though these ones can move full articulation, you have a flexibility on a level that's totally different here. Now, in order for it to classify as lamellar, then they would have to be arrayed in this manner, where this row is on top of this row is on top of this row, working your way up. And my guess is that it is in that fashion, because when you see what happens to the scales when you line them up in this fashion. So this last row wants to fall away, and if you imagine that is on the bottom of your body, and for some reason it falls away, it will end up doing that, which would be quite annoying. So my suggestion would be here in this case, very simply, to array them in this fashion. You will always get them staying where they need to be. So that's why I believe that these are pure lamellar, and so is this example. So is this example as well. And these ones will concertina or come up to just past the bottom of the next row's midribs. Whereas these ones, arrayed in the crisscross arrangement shown here for 336, doesn't give you that much. Gives you play, but not as much as what these ones are, and accounts for that flippage that's happening in the photo, where rows and rows are shown from the back, and in some cases they're shown from the front. It's due to the ability of these rows to be able to fall back in that manner. Okay, so let's have a look at the PDF file a little bit closer, and what you'll notice here are images of the actual scales. Let's see if we can zoom in, blow up this page. And here are the different types of scales, or images of the scales. And ones that I've made copies of are 270, which is here. I've made copies of type 2A, which is 270 and 281. when we go down and have a look at some of the other scales and their types. So that plate was for bronze armor scales from Nimrod, and when we go down, we've got images here. Here. So this is type 308, 12B. This one here is the one that I've recreated and is number 309, type 12C, number 309. It has 1 hole, 2 holes, 3 holes, 4 holes, 5 holes, 6 holes. Usually there's a hole here, but it's missing. So in this case, you have 2 for your gathering, actually 3 it looks like. So not only do you have here and here horizontal rows together, but over here too, and then you're left with 2 holes at the bottom. So this one's a little bit more unusual in that it doesn't have a hole up at the top of the midrib. And notice the variation in the location of the midribs is crucial in their design for ancient Assyrian body armor. So that 309 that we just saw, and this is the 336. The 336 is important because they've used an example of it here. Unfortunately, there is no 335. And again, because these ones are armor scales, when we look here at the bottom, these are iron armor scales from Nimrod. They don't have typologies like the bronze armor scales do. So in this case, we have to take for granted what is shown here. And although we have a representation of 336 here and 336 here, this is the smaller example that I've chosen to represent the 335 as well. Hopefully we can, and in this case, see how there's nothing in this area here, which to me signifies the fact that on this particular scale, this section here hasn't been drawn in because it no longer exists. It's not there to be able to be drawn in. But we'll go and we'll have a look at the images that have been provided in this thesis. And here is an arrangement of iron armor scales from Nimrod 336. We just saw the actual individual plate. And here you can see the crisscross method that's been suggested to create those X's. And here is the arrangement of the 309 bronze armor scales from Nimrod. So this is very important. We have these to go off, but they are drawings. And here are some of the examples that he's drawing. Here's the herringbone pattern from the time period of Sargon. This herringbone pattern lasts until the reliefs of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal as well. So this herringbone pattern is in Ashurbanipal's designs also, not just this. I've seen herringbone patterns from Sennacheribs and Sargons. The earliest I've seen are from Sargons, Sennacheribs, Esarhaddon. We don't have much as in the way of ancient Assyrian reliefs yet. But here is the Sennacherib version of the armor that I showed you that was from the Metropolitan Museum. Now, actual arrangement of armor scales. Yeah, okay, if that's actual. Here, so these are the Sennacherib type. Notice the large hole at the bottom, and you can make out slightly the 2 holes here, the 1 hole here, and then the 2 holes up at the top. So this is the scale that's giving the crisscross effect to produce scales or an armor, body armor, that mimics ancient reliefs in the case of Sennacherib. Now, this is the 309. Notice that's a 265. Okay, so that's the number of the armor scale. Here is the number of the armor scale which we identified earlier, 309. These are the 309s, but you can see how small the image is. So let's kind of zoom in as much as we can and see what we can identify in this image. Okay, so now we've blown it up quite a bit, and this is reasonably good location. Okay, notice there's a raised area on the side of the scale here. Now, in the actual image, they don't provide that raised rib section, and what that might suggest, this is just a theory, is this could be the end of, like, the end plates or the end of the row. So the ones that are at the end of the row have this raised rib on the side, possibly. That's a very possible suggestion, because we can't really identify that raised rib on the other ones, but they could all just be raised ribs as well. What I can identify is the crisscrosses. Notice the crisscrosses are on the actual rib location. That's the central mid-rib, and then you have the stitching going across that central mid-rib section here, here too. So here and here. So in this case, they would be going up to the next hole, the bottom hole of the top row above it. Here you can see the crisscross. You can see the crisscross everywhere. You can see a crisscross, and here possibly we can see traces of suggestions regarding horizontal lacing, but I could be mistaken. It could have just ended up like that, which were originally crisscrosses, but when you have the play in the style of stitching which this allows for, in the lamellar type of stitching, you can still get these awkward areas. Here it's totally over the mid-rib section. So here again is a possible, what looks to me to be a possible horizontal, as well as the crisscrosses. So you have your crisscross, you have your crisscross, you have your crisscross, and then something that would suggest possibly horizontal, but that's not as easy to confirm as the crisscrosses that you're getting to the rows. Now, in this section, look at this placement of the scales. Here are 4 scales, and they're right above each other. So they're next to each other and above each other, and this is the next two, and this is the next two, and this would be the next two underneath it, which to me suggests that the arrangement has slipped into something that's gone misaligned due to the flexibility of the stitching itself, not because they were arrayed in that position from the very beginning when they stitched the scales together. So that's a look at 309, scale 309 in a little bit more detail, and we'll have a look at some of the 335 scales, and I'll show you how bad that photo is. So imagine how much have I zoomed in. God knows. Here we could probably, can we zoom in? No, that's maximum. We can't zoom in anymore. Now, here is a very confusing example of the armor scales of 335/336. Now, what we see is a confusing mess of fused iron scales, and it's this is the example that's meant to be giving them the lacing, the confirmation of the actual arrangement and lacing system of ancient Assyrian scales. And here is where I would like to disagree with. However, we are using a very low resolution image. That's the best image of this ancient Assyrian scale armor that I could find. And what we see in this section here is the scales arrayed in the correct position, but then, and notice the arrangement. You can see the raised rib in the front, in the lower end, or in the upper end of the scale here too. You can see the raised rib, and then the flat part. But then we get a bit of a mess. So in this case, it's ordered in the correct fashion. And then look at here. These scales with the curved heads have been flipped, and then this row is the row that's actually on top of this one, but has fallen back, so that you have square ends here, and then the falling back of the row due to the stitching in this case. Now, I can't tell properly from this photo, but if there is stitching across the bottoms here where the straight edge is, then on the back, which these are, then my theory would go out the window. However, to me, it looks like that the stitching is here apparent across that front and from the midsection of these scales here. So they've been flipped flipped over, as I've showed you how easy it is for the scales to fall back in this fashion. But if it was apparent, they would have in their arrangement stitching here, which they don't seem to have, which confirms my theory of stitching, which is a lamellar fashion. And then when you look lower, you can see here in this section the scales arrayed in a different order again. So yeah, we can get a glimpse of where the midrib is. Here is the hole, here is a hole. I can kind of gauge another 2 holes, so that's 4 holes. We need 6. So the ones that we haven't identified are the 2 side ones, which means it's either on this side or on this side. To gather the rows, and then the one above the midrib, one below the midrib, which gives you an example that's identical to the 336 sample that I had created in replacement of the fact that there is no image of the 335 except this to go off. So here is my confirmation that I'm trying my best to do what's actually based from ancient Assyrian archaeological evidence. Had we have had much clearer images, then we would have been able to identify exactly what's going on and not just take someone's word for it. We all could have seen whether or not the rows are arranged in the method that's been suggested in this section. So, but again, this is that 335 image of armor scales was where they've then taken the evidence to reconstruct the 336, which was then used for the example that the British Museum gave as their lacing system. So you can see where the confusion has happened. Anyway, that's a little bit of the actual evidence in a more in-depth. you.